In History 121, we talk a lot about India. It's one of the earliest human civilizations, had a tremendous influence throughout human history. The largest democracy in the world is actually in India today. And in this class, we last talked about Mughal India, which you may remember we talked about how it was this very powerful, very advanced civilization. It was interesting because you had a Muslim minority ruling a Hindu majority, and there were other religions as well that aren't Hindu and aren't Muslim. But for our purposes, we didn't really talk much about them. And I wanted to, just as a reminder, this was a very advanced civilization. On the right, you can see this tremendous, beautifully constructed Taj Mahal, which was made by one of the Mughal emperors in honor of his deceased wife, to kind of as a remembrance of his beloved. And so this brings kind of a problem, right? Brings kind of an issue. We had this very ancient, very powerful civilization that the British are going to be able to come in and conquer. And this is kind of striking because Britain is just a lot smaller than India. And so we need to talk about how that happened and what influence the British are going to have on India. And we need to kind of understand how this happens, right? So remember, first of all, we talked about how Aurangzeb, one of the last of the Mughal emperors that was an effective emperor, while he had followed he had been very powerful in his own right, he had followed policies that would, especially moving away from religious tolerance, that will lead to rebellions and problems for his government. And the Mughal empire will become weak and will essentially fall apart. That there will, for a long time, be a Mughal emperor, but he will, in most cases, actually just be a figurehead, and India will fall apart into multiple fighting governments that are often at war with each other. And you may remember I made the analogy that if you have a rich country, or rather a rich house with no one in the house or no one there to defend the property, people will come in and steal it. So we have India, which is still very wealthy, has a vibrant economy, but lacks political unity, lacks political power in a sense. That gives the kind of opportunity for the British to come in and develop their power in India. And you can kind of see this if you look at this map in the left part of the map in 1767, you'll see that the British do control some areas in India, not a huge amount, but they do control a respectable amount. And we will talk about in a bit how they get that kind of foothold there in a sense. In the middle, you can see this is 1805, and you can see that the British both control a large amount of India, but also indirectly rule other parts. It says Indian states allied with Great Britain. So there's areas that the British control directly, and then there's also their allies. And that's about half or so of the subcontinent. In 1857, we'll talk about why that year is important later, you can see that the British control either all of India or have what are called dependent states. That's an example of indirect imperialism, where there is a ruler in those countries or those areas that are that's Indian, but is answerable to the British, right? So the British rule through that emperor or through that ruler. So by 1857, all of India and even into Burma is governed either directly or indirectly by the British, right? They're practicing both direct and indirect imperialism at the same time, direct and indirect rule at the same time. And by 1857, they control all of India, both either directly or indirectly through these dependent states. So how did this happen? Well, first of all, we need to start with the group that actually did most of the conquest was not the British government per se. It was the British East India Company. So remember when we talked about the Dutch East India Company? How it was kind of like this quasi-governmental thing where it had like, the Dutch had their own, the Dutch India Company had its own military. You had the same thing here. The British East India Company has a kind of relationship with the British government that gives it a monopoly on certain products such as tea, and also allows it to carry out policy and to have armed ships and its own military. And the British East India Company, when it comes to India, its primary purpose is to trade. That's what they want to do. They're there to make money. So they follow a policy of adaptation and toleration. They are not interested in assimilating Indians. They're not interested in trying to civilize Indians. For one thing, many of them respect Indian civilization. It's very advanced. India is very wealthy, and that would be bad for business. Right? You don't want to sit down with someone who you want to make a business deal with and start off with a lecture of how they need to become British in terms of culture and how they ought to really give up their old religion and become Christian. right? That would not go over well in your business meeting. So they're going to follow a policy of adaptation and toleration. They will try and adapt and in a sense become Indian in some ways themselves. And you can see that on the picture on the right. That's an East India Company trader sitting on the right. You can see it's a white person, a British person, dressed as a Indian person. He has pictures on his wall of his family, but he also has a court, a group of servants and other people who are Indians. So the key thing here is he is adapting and living an Indian lifestyle while he's there. He may even have an Indian wife or mistress and have children who then are part Indian. So this is definitely a kind of adaptation. This is kind of toleration. Now, the British East India Company has been in India for a very long time, and they actually first came when the Mughal Empire was still powerful, and they were happy just to come there and trade and, adapt to India and just, not really try and change India. They want to make money. However, as the Mughal Empire breaks up into multiple states and you have fighting, that's kind of bad, right? When you want to engage in trade, trying to trade during war can be very difficult. There's bandits, there's a breakdown in social order. Someone might just try and come in and take your stuff. Someone might murder you and take your stuff because security order has broken down. So this is bad for trade in a sense. The East India Company wants things to be nice and stable for trade. And remember, they have their own army, right? They will further develop their own army and use it to both defend themselves and to intervene on behalf of their allies, right? So we have a company that initially is there to trade, but will increasingly become a military as well. In the name of trade, right? The military will serve their trade interests, but they will be having a military. They will expand that military and intervene on behalf of their allies, primarily for economic interests. Now, I want here to give you an example of how the East India Company is going to start moving just from not only having a military, but actually becoming like a state, like becoming like a government that engages in political action. And to do that, I need to tell the story of a man named Robert Clive. Robert Clive is a fascinating person. He basically started off in Britain as kind of a thug. He was like this kid who led a gang of other kids, and they organized what we would call a protection racket, which is a fancy name, which just means that they would come into your store and say, hey, you got to pay us $100 a month or we're going to come back and mess up your store, right? That's a protection racket. You pay a gang for protection against that gang, that you pay them money so they won't come in and mess up your store. And he kept doing things like this. And basically they decided, we got to get rid of this guy. And he was shipped off to India. And he became a merchant there as part of the East India Company. He found it really boring. He tried to deal with the boredom by taking lots and lots of opium. And then he became so bored, he actually tried to kill himself. He tried to shoot himself, but the revolver jammed and he didn't die. Or I should say the gun jammed. They didn't have revolvers then. Gun jammed, he doesn't die. Now, what's happening in India, this is about the time period of the 7 Years' War. Remember, we talked about the 7 Years' War, and it's going to be fought in all these different areas. We focused more on the naval battles earlier, but one thing I want to stress is there's going to be competition on the land here between the British and the French over their influence in India, right? So the French are there too. They're in competition with the British. Now, there's an area in eastern India, which we saw on the previous map, called Bengal. And the ruler there, who was ruling in the name of the Mughal emperor, even though the Mughal emperor was very weak now, he supported the French. He was allied with the French against the British. And he and the British had been having some friction over issues of trade. The British were trying to expand their fortresses because they thought they would get in a war again, and he didn't like that. So there's going to be a war between the Nawab of Bengal and his French allies on one side and the British on the other side. And Robert Clive is going to be the man who will lead the British soldiers in this battle, as well as the Indian troops. And this is one thing I want to highlight. Clive will have about 800 Europeans, including men who are dressed like that fellow on the right. That's what a British infantryman, what they would call foot, looked like in this time period. He will lead an army of about 800 Europeans with some artillery, as well as 2,100 Indian troops. And this is fairly typical that most of the British army in India, or I should say the East India Company army, most of them are actually Indians, right? So they're Indians working for the East India Company. They will be in battle against 50,000 Indian troops and some French artillery. And what's astounding is Clive wins, right? Clive will defeat a force of Indian troops more than 20 times the size of his own force. How does he do that? Very simple. He bribes his enemy. The leading commander of the Nawab of Bengal really would like to be Nawab himself, and Nawab is a ruler. So Clive gives the commander of most of these forces, most of the forces against him, he bribes him. He gives him money, and he says, if you support me in this battle, if you don't fight, then I will make sure that you become the next Nawab. And the guy does it. So this is really, I think, a fascinating battle. I don't talk a whole lot about battles in this class, but I think it's fascinating to win a battle by bribing your enemy's chief commander, right? And so that's how Robert Clive will win this battle, is basically by buying off his enemy with a lot of money and by promising that that guy will become the next ruler. Now, I want to highlight this battle happens in 1757, right? 1757. So during the 7 Years' War. Now, one of the key reasons I wanted to highlight that year of 1757 was the British tried to rule through the Nawab, the one that they appointed. And you can see on that picture on the right, that's a picture after the Battle of Plassey, where Robert Clive, he's the guy standing on the left, is talking to the man who was willing to betray the old Nawab in exchange for a lot of money and for becoming the new Nawab. So the British try and rule through that guy, and he actually would like to rule independently. And the British don't like that, so they put more pressure on him. He rebels in 1759, so he only gets to rule for like 2 years. And then he rebels. The British defeat him and appoint a new Nawab. And so here's the key thing, right? The British, because of their military power and because of their willingness to kind of play Indians against other Indians, it allows them to become more and more powerful, right? Like I said, this is going to be an example of indirect rule. They rule through this Nawab initially. It doesn't work that well. The Nawab doesn't do what they say and is upset with them. So he rebels. They get rid of him and appoint a new one who is more likely to do what they say, right? Who's more likely to do what they say. And one thing that they do is they get permission to do things like start collecting taxes, right? They have this new Nawab who is going to go along with them, and they'll say, hey, how about you give us the right to collect taxes? So they'll start collecting taxes, which gives them more money that they can use to build up their armies. So we have a company that had an army that then used that army to gain power and start doing things like taxing, which is basically having a government, right? And they use this infrastructure to continue to build up their army and acquire more and more territory. They're going to acquire increasing amounts of territory. And what's striking about this is that they have the assistance of Indians to do this. If the Indians had said, oh, we don't want you here, and united and tried to fight the British would be easily defeated. Remember, even the so-called East India Company army is mostly made up of Indians. So the Indians can only rule, the British can only rule with the help of the Indians, right? The British can only rule with the help of the Indians. The reason the Indians don't unite and kick them out is because the Indians in this time period essentially lack nationalism. Remember, nationalism is this idea that each nation should have its own state, and that state represents the nation. Well, the British and the Indians are clearly from different nations. However, the Indians don't have a sense of unity among Indians. The concept of an Indian actually wouldn't really be that powerful in this time period. Indians would think of themselves as being from particular areas or belonging to particular ethnic groups, right? India, when I say Indian, it actually encompasses a large number of different kinds of people. So the fact that the Indians lack nationalism means that they're divided. It means they're willing to fight each other, even with the British pulling the strings. So the Indians lack nationalism that allows the British to come in and divide and rule, to use Indians against other Indians and slowly expand and develop their power. So they go from just being a trading company to an actual government that has the ability to collect taxes, which of course it's going to use to even expand its military further. And on this slide, I just wanted to give you an idea of what these Indian soldiers would look like. And I think this is interesting, this kind of mix you can see of British and Indian styles. which went into this Indian army. And many Indians who served in the British Army were proud of the fact that they served in this East India Company army, right? There isn't the sense of nationalism that, like I said, they're willing to work with the British. They see their interests more closely aligned with the British than their interests are aligned with other Indians. That will change, however. Indians will become increasingly frustrated as India increasingly becomes a colony. So remember that Nawab, who had helped the British to win the Battle of Plassey, expected that he would actually be like an independent ruler. He wasn't. Right? The British expected him to listen to them. When he didn't, he rebelled, and the British got rid of him and chose someone else who they thought would be more pliant, who would do what they say. So Indians will increasingly have a subordinate position in their government, which many Indians will slowly realize and will be very upset about. They realize that the British, rather than being their allies and helping them advance their own interests, are increasingly becoming their masters and making the Indians do what the British want them to do. In addition, increasingly Indians will become subordinate in their own economy. So to give you an example, remember early on the British would go to India to buy Indian cloth. Right? They would go to India to buy Indian cloth. But now the British, thanks to the Industrial Revolution, are going to start selling the Indians cloth and putting the Indians out of business because they can't compete with industrially produced cloth. Right? The Industrial Revolution is just able to make cloth that much cheaper. And so the Indians will go from selling cloth to the British to selling cotton, which the British will then turn into cloth and sell back to the Indians, making the British a lot of money. And this increasing subordination of Indians in both the government and the economy is going to spread as British rule spreads. In addition, increasingly, as this moves from a trading company to more of a government, the British will insist that Indians become more like them. As you can maybe guess from the issues about religious tolerance in the Mughal Empire, religion was and is in India a very touchy, sensitive subject. And so the British were able to rule as long as they tolerated Islam and Hinduism and did not support the conversion to another religion. But remember, Britain, especially in this time period, understood itself as a Christian country, and there was pressure on the East India Company to allow Christian missionaries to work more in India, and these missionaries would get increasing permission to come to India to conduct missionary work. And this was a very sensitive issue to many Indians because they saw Indians who converted to Christianity, if you were Hindu or Muslim who converted to Christianity, you were basically seen as kind of a traitor. That was considered very bad. And when you put all these things together, you put all these things together, all these frustrations, that's going to lead to the breakout of a rebellion in 1857. That's why that map we looked at earlier stopped in 1857, because that's a very important year. That's the year of what the British call the Indian Mutiny, but what Indians call the First War of Independence. And we call it, I use the word, I think it's usually important to follow what the people from the country, what they call it. So like this is from, primarily from Indian history, and they call it the War of Indian Independence, the first one. And normally I like to follow that. Here on the PowerPoint, I actually use the word Indian Mutiny, not because I think that it's a better word. In some ways, I think, or generally, I think First War of Independence is a good word. The reason I say Indian Mutiny here is I want us to focus on the aspect that it was the Indian military primarily that was leading this war for independence, right? It is Indian soldiers, the people who had the most contact with the British, who are going to help lead this war for independence. They will rise up against the British in an attempt to kick the British out because of this rising frustration. And this is not pretty. This rising, for example, when it starts, it's launched on a Sunday because the Indian troops know that the British soldiers will be in church. So they launch it on a Sunday and attack them when they're least expecting it. Remember, these are Indian soldiers working for the East India Company. So the officers had no idea that these guys were going to really rebel and rise up against them because they were their own soldiers. In addition, these Indian soldiers massacred British civilians, which, of course, the British were very unhappy about. And this included civilians who had surrendered peacefully with the promise that they would not be massacred. So this made the British very angry. The British responded in kind by massacring Indians. Indians from any area where this independence movement had broken out were routinely massacred. This included civilians, people who could not be possibly participate in the mutiny or war for independence would be included. And also you can see here in this painting is a little bit inaccurate. The uniforms are wrong. But the key thing here is one thing the British would do is when they captured mutineers, they would often execute them in dramatic ways as a message, hey, don't attack us. And in this, you can see that they're tying up these poor Indian men to artillery pieces, to cannon, and they will fire the cannon, which will literally just blow these poor guys to bits. So there's going to be a lot of bad actions on both sides. There's going to be mutual massacres and this really terrible treatment of each other. Now, the Rising would be crushed by the British by 1858. The British then decided that, hey, the East India Company is not doing a very good job, and so the British government will engage in direct rule. There will be a moving away from this policy of allowing Christian missionaries to have so much freedom to try and convert people to Christianity, because it's realized, hey, the Indians are very sensitive about this. We need to be careful. But this will also create divisions. The British and the Indians will find that it's very difficult to trust each other because of the mutual massacres. But also what's key too is we're not yet to Indian nationalism. Some Indians are not really going to trust other Indians. And you can see that here in this this picture. These are Indian members of the people who had rebelled being hung by other Indians, right? While some Indians will rise up against the British, other Indians will stay loyal to the East India Company, to their officers, and will not rise up. And what's interesting is a lot of these people who don't rise up are members of minority religions. People, Sikhs, for example, this is a non-Hindu, non-Muslim religion. It's kind of a blending of the two. They will not rise up. A lot of them will not fight for the rebels. They will fight on the side of the British. And a fairly large number of Muslims soldiers will also choose the side of the British. So even though there's a growing kind of unity in India, against British rule, there are still serious divisions often connected to religion, and these will shape India and what will happen to it when it eventually gets independence. Now, again, we have to kind of deal with this question. In a sense, imperialism can have a positive side in that it brings contact between civilizations. It can also often be very useful. For example, as we'll talk about later, the British will bring in ideas of democracy, of liberty, of freedom into India. And if you're like me and a liberal, according to the definition I gave earlier, then, this is a good thing. But again, I want to emphasize, and especially people who try and defend imperialism, they need to face this, and we need to understand this, because this is why, even if a country is bringing some good things through imperialism, why you fundamentally do not want to be a colony. So, for example, in the years 1876 to 1878, there was a tremendous famine in India, or I should say in parts of India. This famine would eventually kill several million Indian people. The British government, though, in India refused to intervene in an effective way. Now, they could have brought food to the people. They had the railroads that could have done it. They could have moved food around in India. And this is important, India is a huge country. It's possible for one part of the country to be experiencing a famine while another part of the country has food. However, the British government in India decided that it was better to take the food out of India to bring to Britain to feed the people there. So here was the thing, right? There was food that could have been used to feed Indians and keep them from dying, but instead that food was brought to British people who were not in danger of starvation, who could have got their food from other sources. They just would have had to pay a little bit more money. Now, what's striking is that basically the British official in charge of India said that this was just okay because, the people who were dying were, in a sense, the inferior people, the people who should be just eliminated by natural selection according to social Darwinism. Right. So when you think about this, right, if you're an Indian, this is the problem. You have a government that ultimately sees you as existing to serve its interests, right? So British people would like some more food at lower prices, so we're going to take that food from India, and even though it would be Indian people are starving. And if you're challenged on this, the British government just says, well, the people that are dying, those are inferior people, and, we're kind of better off without them. This is also, in a sense, why I would argue democracy is a good thing, right? Because a British official could never say that about British people. If British people were having a famine and a British official says, well, that's fine. Those British people who are dying are, inferior people, so it's better to get rid of them. That person will be voted out of office. But Indians, because they are living in a colony, they're being governed in the interests of the mother country, which is willing to sacrifice millions, literally several million Indians die in this, of their lives for the interests of the interests of Britain here. So this is again why Africans and Indians, even if there were benefits coming from empire, might still prefer independence. So, in a sense, imperialism is very complex. And like a lot of things we see in history, we can say there's positive effects and negative effects. First of all, one thing we have to remember is the Mughal Empire had fallen apart. There was a weak state, or rather no state in some places. And there was fighting and conflict in India. And by establishing a strong state, that led to more peace and order. Right. So in a sense, in a chaotic situation, the East India Company and later the British government is able to establish a strong state that helps bring increasing peace and order to India. That's a good thing. They would also help to build modern schools, more schools, including ones for girls who were often neglected in traditional Indian schools. They would also help establish a modern infrastructure such as railroads and telegraph lines and all those things. They, of course, restricted sati. Right? Remember sati, this idea of widow burning, which I think most of our audience here would say that is a problem, say that that's a good thing to end. They also brought basic improvements in health services and sanitation, modern medicine. That's certainly something that's positive. The Indian population will increase a lot, in part because of the better health services and sanitation that the British would bring. And of course, the British, being a civilization built around ideas of liberty and democracy, helped lay the basis for a modern democracy in India as well as for a modern economy. So there certainly were positive things that come out of the empire and of imperialism sometimes in general that we cannot deny. These things did exist. However, we have to understand then, why, if you were having so many good things in a sense come, why would people resist imperialism? Well, one of the big things, of course, is Indians are becoming second-class subjects in their own country, right? Indians are second-class subjects in their own country. And that's connected to the second problem. The benefits exist primarily for the British, right? The benefits exist primarily for the British. So, for example, sure, the British will build railways, but remember, those railways were being used to take food to ports and out of India when Indian people were starving and could have used that food. So these benefits, a lot of the positive aspects I talked about, developed in accordance with British needs. And a lot of times, because Indians are second-class subjects, their needs will come second. Even if they're dire, even if we're talking about survival, the needs of the British will come first. In addition, the Indians often are paying the bill. It's not like the British are just giving the Indians money and giving them railways. A lot of times, or just giving them schools, while sometimes those will be built with charity or from investment in Britain, a lot of times it's coming from resources extracted from India itself, right? It's coming from resources extracted from India itself. So in a sense then, the Indians often pay for the empire, while the British get the primary benefits. And so wouldn't it be better from the Indian perspective if they paid for the empire and got the primary benefits? Right, so that's the primary problem, right? When you're a member of an empire, even though the empire that you're a part of might give you some advantages in some ways, might help you development in some ways, ultimately you exist to benefit the mother country, in this case, England, Great Britain, and your needs are secondary. And your resources are being extracted primarily to benefit the mother country, not necessarily you. If you benefit too, that's great, but the mother country comes first. Now, I don't want to pick on the British because I want to stress this is just imperialism. I'm just using the British because in a sense they were really good at it and built a gigantic empire. And we know a lot about it because it's similar, British culture, they write in English, it's similar to American culture. Other people were doing this too, right? It's not just the British. We talked about Americans doing this, the French do this, the Germans do it. A lot of people do this. But one thing I do want to point out about the British system that makes it interesting is, remember, the British argue for education. They argue that they're in India to bring civilization. And a big part of British civilization is the idea of democracy and idea of liberty. So they're educating Indians with ideas of democracy and liberty. And eventually Indians will start saying, well, we didn't elect all of you to be in charge of us. We want to be free and independent. And based on that civilization, right, based on that education, that belief in democracy, eventually the British will leave largely peacefully from India.